Good morning all. Sponge-worthy courtyard today. This is a 6x9 sheet of Arches 140-pound cold press paper, and I'm doing my initial sketch with a 2H mechanical pencil. Now for this sky I'm going to start with Naples yellow in along the roof line, and for the upper part of the sky I'm going to mix up a bit of cobalt blue and let it run down into it. I'm using the flat brush, my half-inch flat brush, to paint around all the structures. Now the board's on a tilt, so my paint is kind of pooling at the top of the roof there, so I'm going to mop that out with a bit of paper towel and just have it a little bit lighter at the roof line. So as you can see in the upper right, it dried with a bit of a hard edge, so I'm going to fix that on the fly and paint over it with some yellow ochre and some burnt sienna. I'm also going to drop in some Payne's gray and a bit of burnt umber and some other colors just to create some texture and some interest in that roof, because I will be going in and inking in shingles afterward. Now this rooftop is in a bit in the background of the courtyard, so I want it to be a little bit lighter because it's pushed back, so I'm using a bit of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, and a bit of burnt sienna. I will be inking tiles over that eventually. Now my palette is conveniently placed right over the area I'm painting, so I'll tell you what's going on in there. I got a window back there, and I've mixed up a batch of shadow color, which is my ultramarine and Payne's gray. I'm going to paint some shadows over to the right to define those buildings, because I've got one set in the background and one to the right, which is kind of in the midground. So I'm putting the shadows in just to define where they are, and so I know where my buildings are in space when I get around to painting them later on. So I've established now that my light is going to be coming from the upper left, so all my shadows are going to be cast to the right. Now once everything dried, I looked at that roof, and of course the painting is at its ugly phase, and I said I've got to fix that before I can go on any further. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in all the shingles. I'm using a medium point Lamy Safari fountain pen for that. And once I get this portion inked in, I'm okay to move on, because I kind of know what my what the final painting is going to look like just by that little bit I've done there. So I'm painting shadows over to the left now, a little bit darker mixture of ultramarine and Payne's gray, given that that building on the left is much closer. So the shadow's a little bit darker. I was using my half-inch flat brush to give me a nice straight edge. And there I can just drag a little bit of shadow at the base of that building in the middle, indicating that there's other buildings in this area. Now I can't help myself. Here I am inking again. There's a building in the background there, which is a bit taller, so I painted the roof a little bit lighter. I'm using the same colors for this roof over here to the left. Now it's going to be in a bit of, that's the shadow side, so I'm putting some Payne's gray in at the base of it. So just the top part of the roof is light, where the light from the left is hitting it. Now my downspouts and eaves trough are all a combination of Davies gray, Payne's gray, and while it's wet I drop in a bit of burnt sienna for the rusty bits. My little potted plant there will be happy. It's getting lots of direct sunlight, so the pot is a light version of the burnt sienna, and the shelves or windowsills are also burnt sienna, and a little bit worn looking because they are exposed to so much sunlight. Now the windows are, as always, kind of the same color as the sky, so they're cobalt blue, and the ones in the shadow are going to be a little bit darker, so I added a bit of ultramarine. For the left-hand side here, I wasn't sure, when I put it all together, I wasn't sure what these buildings on the left would be doing. So as I was working my way through the painting, I thought maybe I'd turn this place on the left, the one I'm working on, into a pub. So I put a large green board across, more or less like signage type thing. Indicate there's a pub or some kind of a local there that people can go to. And here I added some small squares to indicate some small windows, like there's a tobacconist or some kind of a storefront anyway where the owner displays all his stuff. So with that kind of mapped in, kind of figured out what I'm going to do with that area, I can start to add some more details and darken up things in the immediate foreground. So I get all my drain pipes and downspouts done. And I can be pretty liberal with the use of paint here, given that they are relatively close. So I can darken those up and then paint the front of the storefront with a weathered looking burnt sienna and some Payne's gray, that sort of thing, just giving it a really weathered type of look. Same goes for the shingles or the roof that's on here. Just a bit of burnt sienna. Using the flat brush to fill in the area. The flat brush does hold a lot of paint. So that was burnt sienna, Payne's gray, and then I can really get into the darker shadows up at the upper left and more Payne's gray. Now these windows in the back, as mentioned earlier, they are exposed to a little more light, so I've gone with a lighter version of the cobalt blue. Initially I was going to try and paint little frames in, but then thought it might be better just to go in afterwards with a pastel pencil and draw in the white frames of those windows at the back. So that's kind of liberating, makes it a little easier to paint them when you've made that decision, or when I've made the decision, sorry. Here, same thing here, nice bright windows. And now my building, my immediate building, my focal point is really starting to come to life. Used a bit of Davies gray. I wanted to break up the walls, that sun-bleached wall look. I wanted to break that up a bit, so I used some Davies gray for the brick above the windows, and then just put a bit of burnt sienna at the base of it. And there was the pastel pencil I mentioned to do the window frames. So now that we've pretty well have all the buildings established, I can get in there with the ink. Again, that's the medium nib. And if you're curious, it's Diatramentis, was I using their archive ink for that. Building was a little plain at the front, so I turned my brush on its side and just dragged across a bit of pigment there to give the wall a bit of texture. I called this painting sponge-worthy. So sooner or later, I better get to the sponges. Oh, of note, I drew my tiles too big at the back. A little disappointed in that. I drew them all in and I realized that they're relatively large for where the building is. But maybe if I hadn't mentioned it, you wouldn't notice. Had to say something. Now I'll just get all these little details and little bits of shadow in before we get to the sponge-worthy portion. So here we go. This is supposed to be a nice bright collection of shrubs or trees in the immediate foreground. So I've put in a really wet mix of cadmium yellow, and I'm going to soften the edges because I want that to be showing through when I do get around to applying the sponge and the greens and all that sort of thing. So there it's dried, and I didn't show it, but I painted a sea sponge. I took some little sap green to start with and a bit of the yellow, and I painted the edges of the sea sponge, and I'm just dabbing in a bit of texture there. And that got a little bit too wet, so I'm going to have to stop and go back once it's dried. So the first application is okay, and now I'm just going to darken up the green again, painting the edge of the sponge. And I'm twisting my wrist as I apply it so that I don't get that stamp look. So I dried the edge of the sponge, and now I've grabbed some really dark greens, and there we go. And even more green for the immediate foreground for the really dark underside. And at this point I decided not to ink around the bushes. They look pretty good on their own, so I'm just drawing a few little twigs, odds and ends in there, getting it signed. Tape is off, and there you have it, a sponge-worthy courtyard. Thanks for dropping by. See you again soon.